Hello, Dan, Adam. Hello. That's weird. There's no one here. The studio's empty. Hello. Man, it really is true. Dan said he was going to go away after the election, and he really did.
Niigaan, what are you doing here?
Adam? Oh, thank God I found you. Wait, why is the studio so empty?
Everyone's been out during our CJNU annual fundraising drive. What are you doing here, mate?
I'm here to tape the podcast. Where's Dan?
He's in an undisclosed location. Probably driving around Florida or sitting on a beach or, I don't know, doing something that's not the podcast.
Oh yeah, that's fine, I guess. I guess I'll just have to carry the show by myself this week. Okay, first order of business is we should rename it. It should be the Niigaan, Me, Myself, and I show.
Sweet. Do you need me to change the intro for that?
Oh, it's fine. Maybe one day Dan will come back to us, and until then, I get his pay, right?
Pay? You guys get paid for this? What? Nobody ever told me.
Adam, just never mind. Just hit the music.
The Winnipeg Free Press proudly presents, in partnership with CJNU 93.7 FM, Niigaan and the Lone Ranger. Here are your hosts, Niigaan Sinclair and Dan the Lone Ranger Lett.
Welcome to the podcast, and we've got a feature interview here with a good friend of mine who is well known to any of you that tune into APTN and watch. Dennis Ward is Métis from southern Manitoba. He has experience in Alberta and Ontario, finally coming back to APTN in 2014. He's the host producer of APTN National News and a show called Face to Face, which is a great show if anyone can catch it. Started that in 2017. And you're an award winner, the Canadian Screen Awards too, nominated in different categories over there for your anchor work. Welcome to the Niigaan and Lone Ranger podcast, Dennis Ward.
Thanks so much for having me. Yeah, award winner, award loser.
Award winner, award loser. Yeah, that's the fun thing about those awards is you go way off to these ceremonies and then you have to watch other people win.
Unfortunately, every year that I was nominated for a CSA so far has been a COVID year, so they didn't even happen. We just had to watch them on TV. Didn't even get to, we had our rooms booked at the Sheraton in Toronto and didn't even get to go.
Yeah, well, that's sad. That's probably better though. Maybe in the end it all worked out for the best. So
yeah.
So let's get started. Dennis, we're in the midst of a pretty crazy, would we say 4 days in the Indigenous world since the coming out or the kind of explosion of this story around Buffy Sainte-Marie and her possible non-Indigenous identity, Indigenous identity. I mean, I think the jury's still out on this. You've been watching this unfold throughout the week. What do you think about this? You know, as the national broadcaster on Indigenous issues, this was not broken by APTN, but certainly I think that you guys had heard about this. It was by the other broadcaster, the other public broadcaster. What do you think about all of this?
Yeah, 4 or 5 days. Wow, it feels like forever. I mean, my social media, Facebook in particular, as we know, is, such an important social media for Indigenous peoples. I don't think there is any discourse on there aside from this. It seems like for the last few days, it's been very divisive. There's people have taken sides over this on whether they believe what's in the documentary or don't care what's in the documentary. It's been hurtful for a lot of people, whether they're people in the music industry, people who are 60 Scoop survivors. Yeah, it's been very divisive and hurtful for a lot of people. I mean, it came out on Friday afternoon at 2 p.m. And so at work, people were trying to catch bits and pieces of it while they could there on Friday. And like people were feeling physically sick by what they were seeing. So yeah, it's been quite a couple days for sure.
I cannot, explain more to our listeners. I mean, we have listeners from all across the world. Some people may not have heard about this documentary that was released on Friday by the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, CBC. And they have an investigative show called Fifth Estate, and they spend 1 hour investigating usually issues of sales fraud and scandals in the government and so on. They dedicated an entire hour to exposing, I guess the right word would be describe, the kind of complicated history of Buffy Sainte-Marie, world-renowned singer who's claimed to be Cree for a long period of time from the Piapot First Nation in Saskatchewan. And the amount of trauma, triggers, and issues that this has brought up for people in the Indigenous world, it cannot be spoken enough of how complicated this issue is, because it brings up issues of adoption. She's claimed to be an adoptee from 1941. She's claimed to then be adopted into a Cree community, so it goes into issues of sovereignty and the ways Indigenous peoples can claim an Indigenous or non-Indigenous person. And then, of course, just the whole idea of this is one of the biggest icons in our area. How would APTN have handled this story differently? Have you watched the documentary?
I have, yeah.
Yeah. Do you notice anything that maybe APTN might have done a little bit differently, or maybe would have asked a question? Because I was on a show this morning where the 3 Indigenous journalists, myself included, said that if there had been an Indigenous reporter leading this, it might have gone in a different direction.
Right. I mean, I think it's worth saying that there were Indigenous peoples obviously involved in this. Some of those people are also controversial. And I mean, I remember one of the people that I think is kind of who spearheaded this all in the background. I remember there being a Facebook post about this a little over a year ago, probably. And everybody in our newsroom had seen it, and it had caused a stir then. So I think other people were also, looking into this story. What I would have liked to have hoped that maybe we would have done, or that could have been more of a focus, is, and I'm sure they tried to speak with the community, and I'm sure they tried to speak with Natanis, who, is a former APTN journalist, and these are people we know, right? Like, that's the other thing about this all. I would have liked to have seen, tell me more about custom adoptions. Like, tell me more about these adoptions, and speak to people from the community out there and family members and stuff. And I'd like to think that we would have maybe gone down that road a little, at least, because that doesn't seem to even come up really in this documentary. And
I mean,
maybe this,
they do talk to the chief, but I thought Kim Wheeler, who everyone, well-known producer, has worked with Buffy Sainte-Marie, is a really well-known figure in the Manitoba Indigenous community. She pointed out that you wouldn't go ask a mayor or a premier about an individual. It's kind of a silly premise. Why didn't the CBC speak to the family? Certainly an Indigenous journalist would have certainly been served a lot more accountability than I think someone in Regina might face.
Yeah, and Kim also spoke about, and so have others, spoken about their own adoption records and birth certificates and things like that. And there seemed to be a lot of emphasis on this woman, the keeper of the records there in Massachusetts, who was like, she's the be all and end all. What she says, that's it. Like, I'm pretty sure different states do it differently. I'm sure different provinces hold these records and everything differently. And I felt like there was a huge emphasis on, well, this woman just told you there's no chance. And that's it. We don't even need to finish the next 20 minutes of this documentary. It's over.
That's right.
So, like, I think there could have been, I need to, know, are there different ways that this happens? And it seems that way. Like, people who were adopted out here in Canada have made their own posts on how difficult it's been to find their own records.
And if the reliance is solely, I mean, that's completely and solely. I mean, the argument is in the other part of the documentary is that I think it's safe to say, estranged family is pretty adamant that she was born in Massachusetts, that her claims to Indigenous identity are fraudulent. I mean, that's what the family is claiming that she grew up with. The complicatedness of that relationship is only lightly touched upon as well. And I think the big question I think everyone really wonders is why now? Why suddenly has this become an issue? She's retired. She's 82. She's not performing any longer. But I mean, what is her role really in the Indigenous world other than just to be an elder and somebody who's not really maybe impacting anyone as much as it would have been, let's say, during award ceremonies or when she was out selling albums? Or, I mean, that seems like when that story maybe should have come out.
Right. And they do say like they've been working on it for a year or whatever. And I can't remember if it's the CBC story or, obviously people who worked on the CBC story leaked all the information to people over at Indians.com. And it was one of the stories that mentioned, that her stepping aside from performing may not be a health thing, that it was more related to what was going on in the background with this investigation.
You pointed out something I think really interesting on social media, and for our listeners, they may not be completely familiar with the Indigenous world and the way it kind of operates, but the way often mainstream media operates is they get a story and then it's kind of, they hold it or they'll drop some hints, which is what CPC did on the Monday before the documentary came out on the Friday. And it's supposed to be embargoed. Anyone who hears about it, you're not allowed to talk about it. But that's not really the way the Indigenous world works. Mm-hmm. Suddenly it started appearing on Indigenous websites, Indigenous news agencies. As you mentioned, this website called Indians.com. It was certainly something spoken about in the Indigenous world, and people were already writing stories about it days before the documentary came out.
Yeah, we had a story up on like Wednesday or Thursday was the first story we had up on it because some of these pieces that are part of this puzzle were in the hands of some of our investigative team as well too. So I don't know how the public broadcaster felt about everybody beating them to their own story in some ways. I mean, you couldn't replicate a year's worth of investigation, although Indians.com really had, I think, pretty much everything handed over to them by the looks of it, and really had the story pieced together as well. So, yeah, I was wondering what was going through the minds of the people over there, thinking like, maybe we should move up the date or something on this. And I don't know that they typically, like, I don't watch the Fifth Estate every week. Do they typically do an afternoon YouTube premiere? I don't know that that's a thing. So I wonder if that's why they maybe moved that up. Also, because as was pointed out in that story, you can't watch, you wouldn't be able to watch it in the US aside from on the YouTube. And I think there was a lot of people south of the medicine line with a lot of interest in this as well.
That brings me to, that story's still unfolding. And so I think everybody wants to hear more from Buffy herself. Because of the gaps in the questions. But that brings me to what I think is a critical role that APTN plays within the media world. And that's really one of the reasons I wanted to have you on. We don't have Dan on with us this week because he pointed this out to me. He said that he wants to know about the kind of conversations that are in your newsroom versus what maybe would take place at the Winnipeg Free Press or CBC or CTV. Or I was just going to tell you about this assignment that I do with my students. I do this thing with my students where I get them to watch the first half an hour of the CBC National, and then I'll get them to watch the first half an hour of APTN National News on the same day. And I'll say, where are the stories? What are the stories? How are the stories being told? And it is fascinating to do that, to line the two shows up and to see. I can remember one assignment we did where national issue around carbon pricing was the lead story, and the lead story in APTN was grandmother teaches granddaughter to bead. And, what is the difference between APTN for someone who's just kind of scrolling through the channels? What's the difference between APTN and what we say mainstream news?
Well, and I think you and I were part of a live event where you would have seen exactly the difference. And that was September 30th. You were on the desk live with us there, and there came a point where all the networks are broadcasting this. I think there was 18 broadcasters doing the September 30th event, including ourselves. And there was coming up a point, it was running late, which these things do. And so the producers were giving the networks an out. They're like, at the top of the hour, you can cut out, and you can see all the broadcasters' logos were popping up. Like, you could see that they were all gonna
actually ran the credits, didn't they? There was they're running the credits to on this was the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, famously called Orange Shirt Day, and this is the big huge thing in Ottawa that singers, dancers, a lot of ceremony for lost children at residential school, and they run the credits, and then what happens?
Well, I assume they all popped out, but what was going on was a residential school survivor was speaking at this very moment that all these networks are just gonna, it's this big day and we're all airing this special, but you only get 60 minutes because we're out of here after that. Or I think it was 90 this year. And we were saying in the studio, like, we're not cutting out in the middle of this residential school survivors speaking in Ottawa in front of all these people. So we hung on to it for, I don't know, it was maybe only 3 more minutes, and she finished her speech. And then we cut out and we came back to us in studio and stuff. But I guarantee you not one other network didn't air their rerun of The Littlest Hobo on time, right? Like, they cut out when they were allowed to cut out. So I think that's a pretty glaring the difference between APTN and some of the other networks is I bet they didn't even consider maybe we should hang on here and listen until the survivor's done speaking. They had to get to whatever they were going to air.
Is that the main difference between being inside of the Indigenous community and outside of the Indigenous community? Because I'm facetious when I say that somebody teaching a daughter how to bead is like, it may not seem like news to someone, let's say, in a major urban metropolitan city, but that's about resisting residential schools. That's about fighting the ongoing trauma for Indigenous women and girls. That's about a community that revitalizing itself so that it can become economically self-sufficient. Like, that little glimpse into a life of what's happening between a grandmother and a granddaughter is really, and then the bigger picture of all the different political issues, world issues, economic issues. That's kind of what APTN's there for, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, some of the stories that we had last week about hide tanning and just trying to think of some of the other ones that, the cultural stories, like, you're just never going to see something like that on another network. I can't imagine. Like, we have, I don't know if the story ran on the weekend yet or not, but like skinning a deer and prepping it for this meal out in Saugeen and stuff like that. Like, you're just not going to see a full 4-minute long story on the importance of all of this anywhere else, I don't think. And when you talk about some of those other issues like MMIWG and stuff, like, everybody covers those now, which I think is in part to, APTN having been doing that for the last 23, 24 years and bringing that to light more. But sometimes we won't have that same story on that same day because we'll be taking the time to, check in with other people related to that story and we're just going about it maybe in a different way than, well, this is the 2-minute story of the day. Let's get it up there on our 6 o'clock newscast and not think about, what the bigger repercussions, ramifications are.
Is that why you came back to APTN? Is that your, I mean, you've been there now for going almost onto a decade, and but you worked in other agencies, other news channels. Is that what motivated you to come back to Manitoba?
Well, my family is in Manitoba. The way that I came to APTN was they were set to launch Thunder Bay Bureau. I was working at the TV station in Thunder Bay, and like if anywhere needed a Thunder Bay Bureau, it was like APTN needed a Thunder Bay Bureau. There was a lot going on there. So I'd applied for that job and I didn't end up getting it. But they're like, hey, we have a mat leave position in Winnipeg. Do you want to come? And it's like, yeah, okay, let's do this. And then like 2 months into the mat leave, they're like, well, we'll just keep you on here. And the balls just kept rolling, I guess, ever since then. But I mean, it took me over a decade to make my way back to Manitoba. So I jumped at the opportunity there for sure.
And a lot of people might not know this, but I encourage you to, check out Dennis on either one of the shows that he hosts. One of the nicest dressed guys on TV, like really, like you have a real sensibility about yourself. As somebody who has absolutely no fashion sense at all, you have a real, does someone talk to you about this? Do you get coaching? You just do it
There's a video out there that I just shot last week that thankfully nobody but the company will see. Is the company that owns Winners and Marshalls are sponsors of our clothing. And so thanks to my sales team for making that happen. And yeah, I've figured out a way to dress myself, but I'm lucky to have a sponsorship for the clothing and people who do my makeup so that I don't look like this on TV.
Well, we are taping this on a Sunday morning. I want to talk to you about something else that I talked a lot about during the pandemic. And, we didn't see each other for a couple of years because, you went out and had children on me I said to me the other day that like you've expanded your family because we hadn't seen each other for such a long time during the pandemic. And, I wrote a little piece during the pandemic that said that APTN viewership went up 28% during the pandemic, and APTN kind of grew up. I mean, that's my opinion, not yours. My opinion that APTN went from being somewhat of a outside of the center channel to something everyone had to watch for the mere sake that the pandemic was so deeply impacting Indigenous communities. Tell me a little bit about what it was like to work at APTN when you were watching this disease rampage through Indigenous communities, the military being sent up north, and the fact that in long-term facilities, elders were dying, entire encyclopedias of communities were passing away.
Yeah, like I'll never forget, we were in Saskatoon, my shooter and I, for the Junos. And out there doing some episodes of Face to Face, we had Adrian Sutherland, musician from Attawapiskat, was out there, and we did one with Don Worm, and
famous lawyer,
yeah. And there was things were happening, like people didn't know what was happening, but then we get back to the hotel and everybody's leaving. It's like, yeah, the Junos are over; they're not happening. People are getting on flights; they're getting out of here, and it was we left the next day and we didn't even know if we were coming into the building to work or to drop off the gear and stuff. Like everybody was still trying to figure it out. And yeah, it was weird times because we're a small crew. So like we lose 2 or 3 people in Winnipeg and it's like, I don't know how we would do a show almost some days. So and in terms of the coverage and watching the things that happened, I mean, I think there's so many stories to still be told about that and what the impact of all that was, the government response, the community responses. I think we saw that a lot of First Nations, they shut down their communities and took matters into their own hands as nations that they are, and, made up their own rules in the way that they thought necessary. But here in the city, I mean, it was just ravaging these long-term care homes and other places that a lot of Indigenous peoples live in. And a lot of people were lost, like you say, encyclopedias of families. And I think that's a huge, huge story that's still just waiting out there for people to tell the true impact of that.
Yeah, I wrote a piece about the loss of the musician Shingoose, and Curtis Johnny, and the fact that he in many ways was one of the founders of Indigenous music in both Canada and the United States. I mean, just coming from a massive challenges in his life, but yet somehow made it to these huge places in music, in the music industry, and then would always bring it back to Manitoba. Always still host shows in Manitoba. The amount of creativity that took place during the pandemic was something that I think APTN brought to the table and brought everyone to a higher level. Like, I'm thinking about the TikTok dance-offs at the blockades that people would be doing between communities. And then I'm also thinking about the videos that elders would be sending out to young people to put on your masks, and quite funny videos that and then all the other different music that was done and so on. And then what I think the evidence of that APTN did to bring light, or to bring the exposure to humor and creativity in Indigenous communities dealing with trauma, was the merman movement. And that you guys ran that merman story for a number of times.
Yeah. Well, didn't you do one?
I did a big story on the merman too.
No, I mean, didn't you do a merman photo shoot?
I did not.
I think you and I were joking one time that we were going to do one if we.
I said if you did one, I would do one.
Yeah, I'm kind of glad that challenge has passed on, and we didn't do that. Speaking of passing on, though, rest in power to Shingoose, man. I got to spend some time with him in his home here, in the long-term care home here that he was in. Prior to his death, obviously, when Native North America, that album came out, and that was a great way to have honored him in the way that the things that he's done. It's too bad that this was during the pandemic, because talk about somebody who deserves like an hour-long special on TV about, the impact. He was on TV when I was growing up here in the city, and he's worked with some of the biggest musicians on the globe. And I hope there is somebody out there that's working on a Shingoose documentary right now, because it's too bad that he's gone, and it came during a time when nobody could really get together or do anything like that. But yeah, I mean, that's the other thing is. And Duncan McHugh and I just did a face-to-face a couple of weeks ago talking about, how there's only the angry Indian, or I forget how else he was saying it. There's only 3 portrayals of Indigenous peoples in the media, the mainstream media. And yeah, to see we're the ones that do a lot of these types of funnier stories, because humor is such a big thing, and so that's another one of them. Cultural stories, humorous stories, like you're probably not going to see those on a mainstream network. You're going to see like the MMIWG and residential school stories more often.
Do you think that this is illustrative of the way APTN, by covering issues? I'm thinking, the last federal election in 2019, and it was a huge moment for me as somebody who works in Indigenous media, because Indigenous stories were in the prime ministerial debates as one of the 5 topics. That has never happened before. And right. Your former colleague, Melissa Ridgen, got to participate in the national prime ministerial debate. I mean, that's never happened before either. APTN's never got a seat at the table. Right. And do you think that, over the decades that APTN has been in operation, going all the way back to 1991, APTN's sort of got this 30-year finally playing with the big kids at the table kind of thing, or the big adults at the table of national media? And do you think it's because of things like elections and doing these stories? And do you think that will APTN go back to being off the big table, or are they here to stay?
I hope we stay at the big table. When you talk about that election, I mean, yeah, that was a huge thing. I think Melissa and I were just talking about this recently. I was talking to somebody about it, but at the end of the day, it was it was still 8 minutes. It was an important 8 minutes for sure, but it was 8 minutes. It'd be nice if we could have an hour with the leaders to just focus on Indigenous issues. But anyways, yeah. We get ratings every week, and they're somewhat believable, I guess. They don't look into some of our bigger markets. Like you don't see, oh, here's the Saskatoon ratings. Like that's just not something that the people who look at TV ratings look into. But I think we had like one of our biggest weeks since we've been keeping track of ratings. And I think part of that is, in the Investigates team and the news, and how important it is to, especially with the loss of Facebook right now, like we said earlier, like Facebook is, you can't even talk about how important Facebook is to Indigenous peoples, I don't think. So that's a big loss. And not just for us. I mean, we did a story on some of the smaller newspapers and stuff like that, Indigenous newspapers and communities and stuff, and they're just taking crazy hits because of the loss of Facebook. But also, on the programming side, things partnering with these other networks seems to be going well. A show like Little Bird, a 6-part miniseries on the 60s Scoop, a show like that, a comedy like Acting Good. Like these are Bones and Crows, things that APTN's partnering up with other networks in order to do some of these bigger productions. And I think that's having a big impact too, in bringing the eyes to the TVs. But also like some of these more cultural programs, like some of our Indigenous cooking shows and stuff like that, Crazy Like a Lynx, like these are like top 3 in our ratings, above like a repeat viewing of Smoke Signals or something, right? So yeah, I think just all around there's more people hopefully paying attention.
Yeah, I think there's an overall awareness of even as someone who's kind of straddles between networks, I'll often appear on CBC, and there's a particular demographic. Like when I'm on an airplane and somebody recognizes me, I know exactly what show it's on. But interestingly enough, the viewership of APTN is noticeably younger, and that's interesting because I think that APTN doesn't. Or APTN appeals to a different demographic than is the typical TV watcher. If you look at most people that are streaming, young people tend to stream, and they're not watching like scheduled news. But yet, whenever I do get recognized off APTN, it's always a younger person, always. That's interesting. I mean, that's interesting. That says that there's a viewership of APTN, which is very much like the Indigenous community, overall much younger. And that sort of gives maybe we're all hip after all, or you're certainly hip.
Yeah, and I mean APTN is into the streaming game with Lumi. So if you're wanting to binge the North of 60 series, which I did before it moved over to Lumi, there's a lot of hipper, younger shows over on that streaming service too.
So just to end off here, there's a few big months coming up for you with the national news team. You're going to cover the upcoming national election, or the national chief election at the Assembly of First Nations. For those viewers or listeners that don't know, we're having an early vote for the national chief because the old national chief was removed forcibly from office, quite in a kind of bit of a scandal. And so APTN will be right there to cover the national chief election. What else are the big issues you think on the horizon for APTN that you'll be covering?
Yeah, I wonder, I never thought about this. So it's probably only going to be like a 2-year term, right? So we've done one election and almost right into the next one, though, when you think about it, for a national chief, that is. Yeah, I mean, that's going to be a big thing. We're up to 5 candidates, going to be 5 candidates come next week. And I think there'll maybe be more. Oh, so what was the cutoff date? Actually, so we'll know, I guess, by like Wednesday or so, eh? Yeah, Wednesday's the cutoff. So
yeah, Wednesday's the cutoff. I mean, the fact is that you've also got potentially a federal election coming up where it will be very much a referendum on Justin Trudeau. I wouldn't say this is going to be a big issue around are the other parties interesting. I think this is going to be a referendum on Justin Trudeau, and one of his major pillars has been on Indigenous issues. So no doubt that'll be something you guys will be talking about. Or
Absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of people, political organizations, maybe more so, might be worried about what it looks like Trudeau, if the election were held today, would be gone. But I think you would have to say that the last, under Trudeau, the Indigenous issues, the money going towards Indigenous issues has been historic. And I don't know that there's many that might want some of those things to end. Because you don't know what's going to happen, right? Like when you compare to, I guess, the Harper days, at least for these political organizations, those were dark days, right? Near collapse days. And now you look at, like, the MMF, for one, is one that I always look at the budget for, right? And if you go back to prior to Trudeau, it was a budget around, I think it was like $9 million annually or something. Now you're talking like $250 million a year, which is going towards, I mean, they're buying property in downtown Winnipeg. They're building housing. They have programs to help first-time homeowners out. The list kind of goes on and on of the things that they've been able to do with some of this stuff. But so, yeah, a referendum for sure on Trudeau, but also in the back of your mind, what could happen if they lose? What do we go back to those days? So, yeah, I mean, I'm a political junkie. I'm excited for both elections. That's just how I am. But yeah, those would be two big things for sure.
Also, I mean, we just came from a Manitoba election. One of my questions I was going to ask you today, but I think I might just know it by this answer, is APTN's national office the headquarters is in Winnipeg. It's not in Saskatchewan. It's not in Thunder Bay, which are very much also hubs of indigeneity, the centers of Indigenous life in Canada. Is it Winnipeg? Is Winnipeg the center? Is it that we've just seen the election of the first First Nations premier in history? Manitoba is also the first province post-Confederation. Is it that Manitoba is this kind of place where it's leading in the areas of Indigenous life and reconciliation, even if I use that word?
I mean, those are lofty, great thoughts, right? But I mean, it was only 6 years ago that we were the most racist city in the world, or in Canada, according to Maclean's magazine. So, yeah, I mean, sometimes you feel like, oh yeah, this is, I mean, electing the first First Nations premier of a province. Like your father said, that's a true act of reconciliation there. But it wasn't that long ago. I mean, just look at what else is going on with the previous provincial government not wanting to search the landfill for, murdered loved ones. The police, I don't think enough is said about the fact that the police a year ago when they announced this were like, yeah, we're not going to do it.
It's not feasible. Yeah.
But they had known about it for months. They'd known that they were probably there months before that.
I think, if I were to add one thing to that, and I've said this a whole bunch of times. In fact, I wrote a column about Chief Smythe of the Winnipeg Police. He's the one that used the term feasible. It wasn't Heather Stephenson, former premier. He's the one that came out and said it's not feasible, and then therefore led to the feasibility study and Premier Stephenson saying it's not feasible.
Yeah, I think that, the PCs did themselves no favors with that campaign, but I think it has been kind of forgotten that, isn't this the police's job to have gone to the landfill in the first place? And
they don't need provincial input on that. I mean, the Toronto police did a search of a landfill for one person, and it was strategic over a period of time, and they didn't ask for the mayors okay, they didn't ask for the premiers okay.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's the challenge here, is that when we keep passing the buck, but perhaps now, and you'll be at the front row of this, do you think that APTN is going to be, covering this government, this provincial government? Typically, because our issues as First Nations, Inuit, Métis people, our number one priority is our relationship with the federal government. But now you're going to be at the front row of a provincial government led by a First Nations person.
Yeah, who's also taken on the role of, Indigenous relations and reconciliation. So we'll see what that looks like. I think there's, I'll also point out that, people would probably accuse us of giving favorable coverage to WAB or Premier Canoe or whatever. But I mean, we'd asked for a sit down with all of the party leaders during this recent Manitoba election, and Dougal Lamont was the only one willing to come into APTN and do an interview with us. Stephenson didn't, the NDP didn't. So, but yeah, I think there's. I think when we did a panel a couple of weeks ago, right after they were sworn in, the day after, it's like, maybe the honeymoon's over. It's time to get to work and stuff now, right? But I don't think it is over. There's a lot of high hopes. There's a lot of ceremonies being held for WAB in the background that the media isn't always, invited to and stuff. I think there was one in his community this past weekend, but some of these other organizations have held ceremonies for him because it is a big thing. And, that there are First Nations women as well leading government cabinet posts. So yeah, I think the honeymoon is still alive and well right now. And in particular, talking about the former Capion Barracks and the First Nations-led economic development zone that's going to go on there, Nawayodina, speaking with the person heading that up on face-to-face last week, there's a sense that having WAB in that office, having Premier Canoe, can help move some yardsticks here.
And absolutely, there's probably, speaking of yardstick moving, there's probably no one who's moved the yardstick more than APTN and the work that you've done. Is this your plan? Is this your, are you going to stay there? Is this your, do you love it as much as when you started? I'm sure being the anchor of a national news show is fascinating. I've also seen you during some frazzle days.
You have? Yeah, I mean, it's a challenge, but I don't know where else I would rather be at the moment. I don't want to go tell pothole stories. Take the camera and the street's got crazy potholes. Those are... I'm good where I am right now.
With all due respect to the pothole cover.
Yeah, I mean, I want to know where the potholes are too. I don't want to wreck my vehicle, but I don't know that there's really many bigger issues than the issues impacting Indigenous peoples in this. I mean, we're still, it's kind of been backburnered, the whole water situation, but I mean, we're still at dozens of communities that didn't get water that were, that was the pledge in 2015. There's a lot of work to still do. We're seeing great things for sure. Big historic moments happening, but man, no end of work to do.
And I can't tell you thanks enough for you taking time out of your day as being a dad and being a busy person yourself. And I'm sure your weekend time is as sacred as mine. So a big miigwech to you for your time, for coming on the Niigaan and Lone Ranger podcast, only with Niigaan, no Lone Ranger. But
Marcy, we've been talking about doing this for a while, so I'm glad we did. Unfortunate Dan wasn't here, but I did a podcast with him for Canada Land a couple of weeks ago, so I guess we got to do one anyways.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming on. Miigwech. Well, we've reached the end of another podcast week, and I want to thank everybody for listening up to this point. And I have some disclosure. Dan's really not sitting on a beach somewhere in some undisclosed location. That's
Are you
just
sure?
me playing around a bit. And Adam, I appreciate you played around too.
But are you absolutely sure that he's not?
You know what? I'm not sure, but last I heard is that he was very ill.
Oh,
so
God bless him.
I guess we will send our love over to Dan and wish him nothing but the best and hope that he comes back next week for next week's pod. But a huge thanks to everybody for coming out today and hearing the wonderful Dennis Ward from APTN. Huge thanks to all the administration and management over at APTN for encouraging and empowering Dennis to come on the pod. Also a huge thanks, of course, to all of our wonderful colleagues at CJNU. And Adam, is there any plug you want to give for the pledge drive? I know that you're never going to accept any money after the pledge drive.
Yeah, no, this is it. We're never asking So CJNU is a non-profit community radio station. We are powered almost entirely by volunteers. I think we have 4.5 staff versus 120 volunteers that make this thing happen. And every year we do our fundraising drive, our pledge drive in the fall. And if you want to learn more about that, you can head to our website at cjnu.ca. There's great stuff up there, prizes, incentives, you name it. If you make a pledge to CJNU before November 15th, you'll be able to get in on some big prize draws. And if you like what we do, we always say, please consider giving your support.
So we can't encourage everybody enough to support CJNU and the wonderful Adam and the great work that everybody does over in the studio there. And a huge thanks also to our colleagues at the Free Press, to Paul Simin and to Wendy Sawatsky for uploading this and continuing to support us. And we also just say a big thanks to all of our families for continuing to support us in this journey of the Niigaan and Lone Ranger podcast. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next week. Miigwech.